A black girl stood up to read a poem in class, and suddenly, everyone wanted to silence her voice. But she didn't choose silence, and when a secret recording leaked, those who once controlled the conversation had no choice but to sit down and listen. This isn't just a story about one girl. It's about every voice that was ever told it was wrong, just because it sounded different. Let's begin. Monday, first period literature. Eldridge Prep High School sat nestled in a quiet Massachusetts suburb, where every brick in its walls seemed chiseled from legacy. The long stone-tiled hallways were so pristine that every footstep echoed like a solemn reminder. This was no place for voices that didn't belong. The modern literature classroom was washed in soft, pale sunlight. On the blackboard, written in neat white chalk, were the words, "Expressing identity through language." Week 4, Zaphira Monroe sat in the last row, a small, 14-year-old black girl wrapped tightly in an oversized earth-toned coat, as if it could shield her from every glance. Her hair was intricately braided, each braid woven with memories from Georgia, where stories were told in the deep drawl of soil. Lullabies hummed with folk melodies, and every syllable carried the weight of heart and history. In her arms, she held a fabric-covered notebook, worn at the edges. She clutched it like a shield. Her gaze was distant, yet alert, nervous, eyes scanning the room. The class murmured quietly, students waiting their turn to read the poems they'd prepared. Then came the teacher's voice, firm, dry, distant. "Zaphira, you're up. Try not to mumble this time." It was said lightly, but it dropped like a cold stone into a still lake, sending silent ripples through the room. A few giggles surfaced, eyes flicked sideways. A boy in the second row murmured, loud enough for everyone to catch, "Probably another one of those country songs again." A girl smirked without looking up, her pen moving steadily across her notebook. The mood in the room shifted. No one shouted. No one used a slur. But every glance, every whispered word, every quiet chuckle was a blade, bloodless, but sharp enough to slice at pride. Zaphira stood. Her wooden chair groaned. She said nothing, just lowered her head and pulled a folded paper from her notebook. Her hands trembled slightly, but her eyes held no tears. In the front row, Jess, the class star, and the first person who'd spoken to Zaphira when she was new, turned to look. She didn't speak, didn't intervene, just smiled faintly, a mix of pity and detachment. Zaphira stepped to the front of the room. She didn't look at Mr. Dalton. She didn't look at anyone. In her hand was a poem, a letter to her childhood beneath a wooden porch, to the grandmother who sang lullabies with no words, and to a voice once scolded for being too country. She took a deep breath and began, slowly, clearly. Her voice low and rich, thick with her southern roots, but beautiful, like the wind sweeping over rain-soaked fields of grain. They told me I had to speak right, but right never sounded like the way Grandma sang me to sleep. I didn't grow up on books. I grew up on songs that were warm and full of salt. Silence followed. No one moved. No applause. No insults. No praise. Just silence. And that silence, it was rejection. Zaphira walked back to her seat, eyes down, shoulders steady. But inside her, a storm raged. No one stood up. No one said anything wrong. But no one said anything right either. And that silence, that collective, willful silence, was the cruelest form of modern racism. It didn't need fists. It didn't need slurs. Just a skewed glance, a harmless comment, a half-smile, was all it took for a child to know. Her voice wasn't welcome here. Just as the silence in the classroom reached its lowest point, Mr. Dalton's dry, precise voice rang out again, this time stripped of any pretense of patience. His words came down like a sentence already written, cold and authoritative. "Zaphira, this isn't your grandma's porch in Georgia. Try speaking like you belong at a proper school." The room didn't explode in sound, but something shuddered, like an invisible jolt of electricity running down the spines of every student. Zaphira was still standing at the front, her hand clenched around the now crumpled poem. Her face didn't change, but her lips pressed tightly together. The way Mr. Dalton said, "a proper school," made it clear. Georgia was backward, and her thick Southern accent was a blemish on this place of refinement. From the middle of the room, Mira, daughter of a high-profile lawyer, hair parted just right, tilted her head and let out a syrupy, sweet voice, sharp as needles. "Wait, was that a poem or a poem she just read?" Laughter broke out, not the quiet kind anymore, but loud, satisfied laughter. The kind that says, a room has just been released from the burden of pretending to respect something it had already judged. Zaphira stood there. Her eyes no longer met anyone's. She said nothing. But the look on her face was like a fog rolling in, where pain had been compressed so tightly it could no longer find a way out. From the front row, Jess glanced over at her, just for a second, but long enough for Zaphira to feel it. That the girl who once offered her a smile on her first day had now turned away, as if embarrassed by something she didn't know how to name. Mr. Dalton made no effort to intervene. On the contrary, he continued, his tone flat, eyes never meeting hers. Point deducted, he lowered his gaze and marked his gradebook with a red pen. Unclear articulation, lacked proper standards. Here, precision in speech is one way we show we belong. Each word landed like a nail in the soft wood of Zaphira's dignity. Then laughter died. The room fell silent once more. But in the air lingered something colder than winter wind, a silent consensus. Zaphira stayed where she was. That sheet of paper in her hand was no longer just a poem. It was a heart squeezed tight, a childhood memory mocked, the voice of her grandmother and her mother and her home, flattened under the weight of power and silence. Then came Dalton's voice again. "You may sit." Zaphira turned back, each step heavier than the last. Her chair creaked as she sat. She bowed her head, didn't cry, but her chest rose and fell, straining against a storm she was trying hard not to release. She picked up her pen, tried to write, to pretend things were normal. But her hand shook. The letters came out, crooked. A blot of ink spread across the page, like a tear that couldn't fall, trapped inside instead. No one said anything, no objections, no defense. And that was the real pain. Not Mr. Dalton's words, not Mira's mockery, but the collective indifference. That silence, bottomless and wide, swallowed every ounce of effort from a girl who only wanted to be heard. The classroom window remained open. Outside, the maple tree was shedding its leaves. One red leaf drifted in and landed gently at Zaphira's feet. She looked down, then slowly bent and picked it up, placing it on the ink-stained page. She didn't know why she did it. Maybe just to hold on to something, anything, that was still whole, on a morning when everything she was had been torn apart by laughter and quiet cruelty. That night, Zaphira's small room was tucked upstairs in a slanted old wooden house, nestled deep in a quiet black neighborhood. A tired yellow lamplight spilled across the desk by her window, illuminating a handful of worn notebooks, colored, pencils, a few hair clips, and a faded photo of her and her mother, quiet relics of memories left behind. Outside, a distant train whistle echoed from the tracks. It was a familiar sound to Southern kids like her. Each night, the train carried with it echoes of Georgia, where frogs sang beneath porches, where Grandma Delilah knitted and told stories, and where summer nights smelled of wet hay and home. Zaphira sat on her bed, back against the wall, knees pulled to her chest. Her old brown notebook lay open in front of her. In the center, an unfinished poem, lines left hanging, but each word was a piece of her soul. Her small hand clutched the page. Then, slowly, without hesitation, she tore it in half. The rip of the paper sounded like a cut straight through the heart. The pieces floated to the floor, weightless, but in Zaphira's chest, they fell like stone. She didn't cry. Not right away. She just stared at the torn paper, eyes hollow. Then, slowly, she dropped her head to her knees, and the tears came, silent, voiceless, a quiet kind of breaking. The door creaked open. Grandma Delilah, a small, weathered woman with wise, steady eyes, stepped into the room. She didn't ask questions. She didn't need to. She saw the trembling shoulders, the torn paper on the floor, and the tears soaking through Zaphira's pajama top. She crossed the room slowly, like someone who had spent a lifetime learning how to carry pain that didn't have a name. Her calloused hand came to rest gently on Zaphira's shoulder. "They laughed at your voice again, didn't they?" Her voice was soft, but layered with years of knowing. Zaphira lifted her head, red-eyed. Her words came out cracked, each one lodged in her throat like a splinter. "They said, I sound like a dumb country girl. They said, I talk like I don't belong. They said I'm different, that I shouldn't talk that way in a proper school." Grandma Delilah didn't answer right away. She just sat beside her, arm wrapped gently around her shoulders. Her gaze drifted toward the window, where the moon barely peeked through bare branches. After a while, she spoke, slowly, her voice tinged with both ache and pride. "Back when I sang lullabies to your mama, the neighbors would laugh too. Said, 'What's the use of singing if you can't even read?' I didn't have much schooling, but I had my songs, and those songs kept your mama from being scared when the thunder rolled. And now, they're keeping you from breaking when the world gets too cold." Zaphira turned to look at her. A faint flicker lit in her eyes, but just for a moment, then faded. She exhaled, lips trembling. I just want to sound normal. Just once. I don't want anyone looking at me. I'm tired, Grandma." Delilah fell silent. She reached up, gently patting one of Zaphira's braids. Then she said, "There's nothing wrong with your voice. The wrong thing is the world not knowing how to listen." Another silence settled over the room, but this one didn't choke. It lingered, soft and open, making space for breath, for thought, for truth. Zaphira stopped crying, but her eyes didn't come back to life. They didn't burn. They didn't freeze. They were just empty, like a candle that hadn't gone out, but didn't have enough wax left to burn much longer. On the floor, the torn page lay still, curling slightly at the edge where her tears had soaked through. Half a poem, half a heart. Outside the window, The Mabai train's whistle returned. Longer this time, deeper, and more sorrowful. It carried with it dreams that never had the chance to bloom, and voices slowly being crushed beneath the weight of crowded classrooms and absent compassion. Have you ever felt like you had to stay silent just because your voice sounded different? If you were Zaphira in that moment, would you stay quiet, speak out, or give up? Share your thoughts in the comments, because maybe, just maybe, your story will be the one that gives someone else the courage to speak. The next morning, the sky was a dull gray. No rain, but heavy enough to weigh everything down. The air around Eldridge Prep felt thick with early fog. Footsteps echoed over the cold white stone tiles of the courtyard, steady, mechanical, and lifeless. Just like the rhythm of this place, polished, predictable, and utterly devoid of feeling. Zaphira sat alone behind the literature building, tucked away in a corridor few people ever passed through. It was the only place in this unfamiliar school where she didn't feel seen. An old stone bench hugged the wall, shaded by overhanging branches that kept distant eyes at bay. In her hands was a small book, Langston Hughes's pocket poetry collection. The corners were bent, the pages yellowed. She wasn't really reading. She just stared at the open page as if it could anchor her to something real in the wake of the emptiness from the night before. Then a voice cut through the quiet. Soft, but clear. The way you read that part about lullabies for babies yesterday, it reminded me of my grandma. Zaphira looked up. In front of her stood a girl with long black hair pulled into a ponytail, sun-kissed brown skin, and a faded school hoodie. It was Inez Ramirez, the quiet Latina girl who always sat near the window, the one Mr. Dalton often scolded for not speaking English clearly enough. Zaphira looked at her, eyes still wary. Around here, compliments could sometimes be traps. Inez sat down beside her, leaving enough space to be polite, but not distant. She didn't look at Zaphira, just stared straight ahead at the wall, voice calm and even. I wanted to say something yesterday, but I was scared. I know that feeling. When everyone's eyes are on you, and the second you open your mouth, they hear everything wrong. Zaphira frowned slightly, but said nothing. Inez gave a small smile. Mr. Dalton once made me repeat the word think 4 times in one class, just because I said it like tink. He told me, "This is Massachusetts, not Miami, young lady." A soft breeze rustled the loose strands of Zaphira's hair. She turned away, hiding a faint smile, not because the story was funny, but because it was painfully familiar. "They want us to change our voices to fit the mold," Zaphira whispered, her voice trembling, as if even she didn't want. To hear the sadness inside it, Inez nodded. "But nobody ever told us that difference could be a kind of strength." She reached into her backpack and pulled out a small, color-printed flyer. The bold letters at the top read, "Statewide Student Poetry Contest. Theme, My Voice. I think you should enter." Zaphira stared at the flyer, silent. But something inside her stirred, quietly, but undeniably. It wasn't pity. It wasn't some hollow attempt at encouragement. It felt like a hand reaching out from someone who had also been drowning and knew how to swim. Inez kept talking. "We might pronounce things differently, sound different, but poetry isn't about how you say it. It's about what comes from inside. And what's inside us has never been wrong." A long moment passed. Somewhere in the distance, the school bell rang, cutting through the air with its usual urgency. Zaphira looked at the flyer. Then she looked at Inez. There was hesitation in her eyes, but something else, too. Something quietly human. She nodded, just once. "I never thought I'd compete in anything here," Inez smiled. "Then start now. Not to win, just to make them listen." The two girls stood. No handshake, no promises, just two small silhouettes walking side by side through the cold hallway, leaving behind the stone bench, where an extra copy of the flyer remained. The wind lifted its corner, just slightly, as if something had shifted, as if something, however small, had begun to change. A week after that quiet conversation behind the school, something had shifted inside Zaphira. Not confidence, not pride, but the calm steadiness of someone who knows they're about to say something that matters. The third-floor classroom had been turned into a practice space for the small group representing Eldridge Prep at the statewide poetry contest. Inside were only 6 people: Mr. Dalton, Jess, 2 upperclassmen, a white boy adjusting the mic, and Zaphira. She sat in the corner, waiting her turn. In her hand was a sheet of paper rewritten more times than she could count. Every period, every pause carefully considered. This poem wasn't about the past. It was the first poem Zaphira had written for the present, for this exact moment. When her name was called, Zaphira stepped forward. No one clapped. No one welcomed her. Just neutral stares. And in those stares, she knew. She was still the outsider. She held up her poem and began to read. Her voice was lower than before. The first line rang out, "They told me to speak like them, but no one said why. My voice holds red clay, lullabies in dusk light, dreams still unfinished, and things they've never tried to understand." The room seemed to slow. Eyes locked onto Zaphira, not out of pity, but because the poem was genuinely good. The way she read it, her rhythm, the words themselves, each line hit like a slow wave, steady and undeniable. When she finished, the room stayed silent. Then, one of the upperclassmen, usually quiet, spoke up softly. "That was really good. I liked the red clay part. Felt real." Zaphira gave a slight nod, eyes flickering with surprise. For the first time, someone believed her. Mr. Dalton nodded too, his tone low. A clear improvement. Jess sat at the corner desk. She said nothing, but her eyes didn't leave Zaphira. Not in admiration, but in something colder, something closer to threat. As the session wrapped up and the students filed out, Zaphira was folding her poem when she heard Jess chuckle quietly, whispering to Mr. Dalton after everyone else had left. "What did you think of that poem?" Mr. Dalton tilted his head slightly. "Very impressive." Jess shrugged, carefully enunciating each word. "To me, it felt a little internet-y. You don't think it sounds, I don't know, a bit too mature for her? Like maybe she didn't write it herself?" Zaphira froze, just a few steps away, close enough to hear every word. Each sentence dropped like stones into a deep well, sending unwanted echoes through her chest. Mr. Dalton paused, then nodded, without looking toward Zaphira. "Better to be cautious. I'll hold her presentation for now. We'll verify." No one looked at her. No one imagined she'd heard. But she had, and she understood. Jess, the same girl who smiled at her on the first day, who once shared her notes during Zaphira's first week, was now using her poem to bring her down. Not because it was bad, not because she'd done anything wrong, but because it was too good, and no one believed she could be the one who wrote it. Zaphira didn't speak. She took her poem, turned, and walked away. Her steps were slow, not rushed, but heavier than they'd ever been. A weariness that settled deep, from her chest, all the way to the soles of her feet. In the hallway, she stopped and leaned against the wall. Her hand gripped the poem tightly, the paper creasing under her fingers. The wind slipped through the corridor. Somewhere in her mind, she heard a voice. "Write your truth." But it was drowned out by the whisper that followed. No way she wrote that herself. Come on. And in that moment, Zaphira felt like she was right back in that classroom. The morning she was mocked for saying poem instead of poem. When every gaze made her feel like she didn't belong, she thought she'd gotten past it. But maybe prejudice doesn't always shout that you're not enough. Sometimes it whispers that you're too much to be believable. A few days after that bitter practice session, Zaphira didn't return to the poetry team. She didn't speak up, didn't fight back, didn't explain. Each day at school, she moved like a shadow, silent and slipping between glances, half curious, half cold, as if everyone had quietly made up their minds. She probably didn't write it. Wednesday, late afternoon. The Eldridge Prep Library, the quietest corner on campus. Long wooden tables, warm yellow lamps, and the scent of old paper in the air. It felt removed from the rest of the world. Zaphira sat in the far corner, flipping through her poetry notebook. Each page held a memory, a part of herself she had once put into words. And now, it was all just evidence for a doubt. Her eyes were tired, not from sadness, but from hope running dry. She reached into her bag, slowly pulling out her notebook. Her fingers gripped the edge of a page, ready to tear. No one would see, no one would care. But then a voice rose behind her, gentle as wind, firm as truth. Don't. It was Inez. Zaphira froze. She didn't turn around, but her hand stopped, mid-motion, suspended above the paper. Inez pulled out a chair, sat beside her, and took out her phone. Her eyes were burning, not loud, but sharp. The kind of anger that comes when right is treated like wrong. I know what Jess said. I was standing behind the door that day, and you're not the only one it's happened to. Zaphira turned, her head, eyes questioning. Inez unlocked her phone and tapped a recording. But first, she said clearly, "Last week, I got held after class, just because Mr. Dalton said my accent was too hard to understand." Zaphira stayed silent. So I started recording group sessions after that. Not to accuse anyone, just to protect myself. And on Monday, during practice, I left, my phone in my jacket pocket. It was still recording. Inez pressed play. Mr. Dalton's voice came through, clear and cutting. I don't understand why the organizers would accept that kind of pronunciation. She sounds like she's singing folk songs, not reading poetry. This is a serious literary competition, not a multicultural exchange program. We need someone who can demonstrate expertise, not someone chosen out of pity. Zaphira closed her eyes, not because she was surprised. She'd heard words like these all her life, just never captured, never permanent. Inez leaned in, her voice low. "My sister's in journalism school. I sent her the clip. If you want to go public, I'm with you." Zaphira opened her eyes. Part of her wanted to say yes. Part of her wasn't ready. She reached into her backpack and pulled out an old storybook, one Grandma Delilah used to read to her when she was little. She opened it, and from between the pages, a folded sheet of paper slipped out, thin and faded, like a memory. Zaphira unfolded it. It was a handwritten poem, her mother's, written in shaky, uneven script, but every letter carried a soul. If you ever feel your voice doesn't belong, remember, mine didn't either. But I still sang lullabies in my own tongue because only that voice could keep you from fear. Zaphira began to cry, not from weakness, but because, in that moment, 3 generations seemed to meet: grandmother, mother, and herself. All of them once told their voices were wrong, and all of them chose to hold on anyway. Zaphira looked up. For the first time in days, her eyes weren't clouded with doubt. They were clear, steady, certain. "I'm going to write it again, but not for the contest, for the answer." Inez nodded. No more questions. Zaphira opened her notebook, picked up her pen, and began, "My voice is not silk smooth, but it holds, like porch twine. It doesn't flow like streams, but it echoes like my mother calling me home in the rain." The poem poured out like a river breaking free, not to win, not for forgiveness, but to reclaim the voice that had been denied. Saturday morning. The campus at Eldridge Prep was quieter than usual, but the East Auditorium buzzed with rare energy. It was the school's public rehearsal for students chosen to represent Eldridge at the statewide poetry competition. The rows filled up quickly. Faculty, staff, parents, students, everyone dressed like they were attending something prestigious. On stage stood a single microphone, lit by warm spotlight. Behind it hung a plain backdrop bearing the words, "We listen, the voice of tomorrow." A powerful slogan. Ironic, really, considering the very people here to listen had spent so long pretending not to hear. Zaphira stood backstage. Her new poem was in hand, printed on crisp white paper, neatly typed, not because she wanted to appear professional, but because her hands had shaken too much to rewrite it by hand a 5th time. Behind her, Inez reached out and placed a hand gently on her back. She didn't say a word, but that small touch, it steadied Zaphira's heartbeat. A name rang out through the speaker system. Zaphira Monroe, Class 9C. There was a ripple through the room. A few people leaned in to whisper. Zaphira knew why. The recording hadn't gone public, but the rumor had. Some said she cheated. Some said someone wrote her poems for her. Others just shrugged, because to them, she wasn't worth remembering. Zaphira stepped onto the stage. Each footfall on the wooden floor echoed like the opening notes of a prelude. No music required. The spotlight found her. All eyes turned her way, and for the first time, she didn't lower her head. She stood at the mic, drew a deep breath. Her heart pounded, but no longer with fear. She lifted her chin, and in the brown depth of her eyes was a quiet blaze. Years of being diminished, now catching light. Then she began. "They say my voice is thick like cane syrup, too raw to make poetry sweet. But my grandma sang lullabies without knowing how to read, and her words saved my mama from fear." The first strike against their assumptions. Soft, but solid. The room fell completely still. I don't speak poetry to compete. I speak it to survive. I don't talk to sound right. I talk to sound true. Zaphira didn't raise her voice. She didn't perform. She spoke. Her voice, southern, unpolished, real, carried all the weight it needed. They told me to change, to fit something more refined. But if refinement means denying my grandma's voice, then let me remain uncivilized. Somewhere in the crowd, someone exhaled deeply. I stayed quiet for so long. They said my voice made people uncomfortable. But today, I know. If I stay silent, the kids who come after me will think their voices are mistakes. Every word, every pause, carved through years of suffocating air in this school. My voice isn't a flaw in pronunciation. It's a map. It's my roots. It's my blood. It's the thing that keeps me from disappearing in a world that wants me to sound like them. An older judge, known for his stern demeanor, nodded slowly. No smile, but in his eyes flickered the memory of someone he'd once known, someone he might have forgotten. Zaphira finished. I'm not reading poetry. I'm rescuing myself, and, if I must, I'll rescue every child who's never been allowed to speak in the language of their own heart. She bowed. No one spoke. For a moment, the silence stretched. Then, the applause. It started in scattered pockets, then grew, steady, loud, enough to shake the quiet, enough to let everyone know something had just been done, and this time it had been done right. At the back of the room, Inez stood still. She didn't clap. She only smiled. But that smile, it was brighter than every light on the stage. In the front row, Mr. Dalton sat upright, hands clenched in his lap. He didn't applaud, but it was clear he was realizing there were lessons he could never teach, because some lessons he still needed to learn himself. After Zaphira's poem, the auditorium froze. A few seconds of absolute silence. No one moved, no chairs shifting, no whispers. Just a 14-year-old black girl standing beneath the stage lights, having just cut through every layer of bias that had long clung to these hallowed walls. Then the applause erupted. It started from the back, where the younger students sat. Then came the middle rows, and soon the entire auditorium thundered. Not with excitement, but with something rarer, recognition. Zaphira bowed her head. She didn't smile. She didn't speak. But her eyes shone. Wet, but steady. The look of someone who had just reclaimed something ancient, something once deemed shameful, her own voice. She had barely stepped off the stage when a side door to the auditorium opened. Heels clicked against the hardwood floor. Unhurried, but unwavering. From that door walked an older woman, tall and poised, her silver hair pulled back, her face stern but not cold. Ms. Winslow, director of the statewide literary program. Her entrance pulled every gaze in the room. Even Mr. Dalton straightened up slightly, eyes tightening. Ms. Winslow didn't head toward the stage. She walked directly to Zaphira, who still stood near the steps, caught in the spotlight's edge. She spoke clearly. No microphone needed. Zaphira Monroe. Zaphira turned to face her, meeting her gaze. I heard your poem, not just in this auditorium, but elsewhere, online, in people's hearts. A ripple moved through the crowd, soft murmurs. Online? What's going on? Did she say viral? Ms. Winslow raised her phone. On the screen, a viral post. Over 80,000 shares. A short clip pulled from the original audio recording of Mr. Dalton. The headline read, "My Voice Isn't Wrong. A Poem and a Revolution Born in a Classroom." She continued, "I received this from a journalist. She's the sister of one of your students. The recording was included. And I think it's time we ask a different question. What kind of teacher makes a student feel the need to secretly record, just to protect themselves?" The room exploded. Gasps, whispers, shifting bodies. Then, Ms. Martin, an English teacher, stood up. "I can confirm it's real." I heard it, and I stayed silent for too long. She turned to face Mr. Dalton. "We used to think careless words didn't matter. But today, I know. A single smirk can crush a child's spirit." Every eye turned to Mr. Dalton. He sat frozen, but the silence around him now wasn't complicit. It was disowning. A junior stood from the middle rows. "You told me my Jamaican accent didn't sound serious. I cried the whole night, but I thought maybe I was just being sensitive." "I did." White girl raised her hand. "You once said I sounded like a baby because of my South Boston accent. But somehow, the kids who sounded like textbooks always got the best grades." Ms. Winslow nodded, then turned to the school board seated in the front. "I believe this school must seriously re-examine its language culture. Because if students have to secretly record their educators to be heard, then we are failing. Deeply." Applause erupted, this time not for the poem, but for the truth finally laid bare. Principal Linden stood, her face flushed red. Her voice trembled. We'll be launching an internal investigation, and Mr. Dalton will be placed on temporary suspension during the review." Another wave of applause swept through the auditorium, this time with soft whistles from the back row. Mr. Dalton stood, tried to steady himself, but his eyes met Zaphira's and broke. Zaphira didn't look at him like a victor. She looked at him as someone who had once been broken, now finally able to forgive herself for ever believing his words. Mr. Dalton walked down the aisle. No one rose. No eyes followed. No goodbyes. Only the clapping continued. For justice, and for a girl who had just taught the system how to finally listen. Early morning, 1 week later, Eldridge Prep was wrapped in soft gray skies, the halls still clinging to the chill of fading mist. The air was calm, not buzzing, but beneath the stillness, something had shifted. Zaphira walked alone, not because she was being avoided, but because now she was listening to the silence with different ears. No more doubting glances, just people still learning how to greet someone who had stepped past the boundary they thought was fixed. She stopped at the bulletin board. A new poster had gone up just the day before. Bright yellow, bold black text, statewide poetry contest. Theme, my voice. Because sometimes, to be heard, you have to be the first to speak. Below that, the list of official participants. Zaphira looked down. Her name sat right at the top. Clear, unmistakable. No one could erase it now. She stood still. In her hand was an old folded piece of paper, her mother's poem, once torn at the edge, once smudged with tears. She smoothed it gently, then pinned it to the corner of the poster, like a whisper that said, "This is where it belongs." "Miss Zaphira?" a shy voice called from behind. Zaphira turned. It was a younger girl, features rooted deep in the American South. Dark skin, high bun hair, and an oversized hoodie swallowing her shoulders. She clutched a stack of books like armor, her eyes bright with quiet worry. "I heard your poem online. I talk like you. People say my voice is too loud. Every time I read, they laugh." Zaphira stepped closer, looked straight into the girl's eyes that mirrored a fear she knew all too well. "Do you know what your voice sounds like?" The girl shook her head. Zaphira smiled. "Like country music at sunset? Like a grandma's lullaby under the stars? Like music the world just hasn't learned to appreciate yet?" The girl blinked, then smiled, softly. But something shifted in her gaze. For the first time, it didn't look like she wanted to change just to be accepted. Zaphira handed her a contest flyer, then pulled out a pen and scribbled a line at the bottom corner. "Passing this voice on to you." The girl took it. Her hands steadied. She held the paper like it was a promise. Then, a voice from behind. Familiar, cool, but gentler now. "Hey, your poem the other day. I didn't really get all of it, but I think I owe you an apology." It was Jess. She stood at the end of the hallway, didn't come closer, didn't bow her head, but her eyes no longer carried that sharpness. Zaphira looked at her and nodded. Not forgiveness, not bitterness, just a quiet closing of one chapter and the readiness to begin a new one. Zaphira and the girl turned back to the board. Neither said a word, as if even time itself had paused just to witness this moment when the small, quiet history of Black girls was being rewritten through poetry. I don't write to punish those who once laughed at me. I write for the children still silent, thinking their voices are mistakes. If I dare to speak, someone else will dare too. And maybe, one day, no one will have to apologize for how they were born. Thank you for staying with us through the end of Zaphira's journey. If this story touched your heart, please like the video, subscribe to the channel, and share it, so more people can hear the voices that were once dismissed as wrong. Because every click from you is a silent nod to justice, a quiet hand reaching out to support the voices still being silenced out there. And remember, you don't have to sound like anyone else to be heard as fully human.